I want to talk to you guys about how people will hate those who help them. People will hate those who do the most for them, who do the most to help them. People will murder their own heroes. And the reason why I am bringing this up is because this morning I was reading this book, Poland's Holocaust, by a Polish historian, Tadeusz Piotrowski. And he talks about how the Nazis murdered the Poles, how the Soviets murdered the Poles, the communists murdered the Poles. But he also gets into these details that we really don't hear a whole lot about. The militias who murdered innocent people. The partisans who murdered innocent peasants. The people who escaped the Nazi death camps only to join communist paramilitaries and then murder innocent people themselves. How people, after escaping the Nazi death camps, only to go about murdering innocent people themselves, how people could do such a thing is just beyond my own comprehension. I really can't fathom this reality. But it is a reality nonetheless. And when we actually take the time to read upon these realities, to read about these nitty-gritty details of history, we get a better understanding of human evil. And also we get a better understanding as to how human beings really haven't changed all that much. We hear our grandparents talk about the good old days. But when we actually read history, one thing that we will recognize fairly quickly is that the good old days is an illusion that people have. And people tend to have these sorts of sentiments when they are feeling very melancholic, when they are struck with nostalgia. We have people in my generation, myself included, who have these sorts of feelings when we think about, the 1990s or the early 2000s. But all of this is really an emotional perception. It's a perception that's based on our nostalgia. And if we just take the time to actually recount or to ponder on the past, on the recent past, we will soon realize that these are just illusions and emotions, and there were no good old days. They don't exist. People have always been brutal. You have always had sadists. You have always had murderers. You've always had deviants. You've always had extremely nefarious people. Now, that is not to say that all people have been evil and there are no good people. And I'm not going to get into that sort of cynicism because I don't believe that. But what I will say is that the heroes are far and few throughout history. Even the Bible recounts this reality. When we read the book of Genesis, God floods the entire world, but he only rescues Noah and his family. Why? Because the heroes are far and few. So when we actually look into the Holocaust, we will read about Polish people who went out of their way to rescue Jewish people from the Nazi death camps. There is this stigma, and you hear this sort of thing amongst certain modern-day historians, that the Polish people were anti-Semitic, that they were that they all loved Nazism. There was even one historian I heard, I forgot his first name, but his last name was Gross. This historian actually went so far as to say that the Polish people murdered more Jews than the Nazi Germans during the Holocaust. This is a blatant and obvious lie, and the fact that an historian said this really shows me that he has his own vitriol and his words are coming out of hatred, as opposed to actually looking at the historical record. And what's so sad is that not too long after the war, the Second World War, these Polish heroes, not all of them, but many of them, were arrested by the communists and tortured and murdered. Many of them were. Um, we have tankies today, and for those of you who don't know, tankies are people who love communism, modern day people who love communism. It's basically like what the alt-right is to Nazism, tankies are to communism. And they'll say things like, oh, if it wasn't for the communists, Nazism would have been would have never been destroyed. It was the communists who destroyed fascism or something like that. And yes, communists did fight fascists. Communists did fight Nazis. But don't sit there and act like these people were all a bunch of righteous saints. They were communists who were evil enough not to really give a damn if somebody actually saved Jews from the Nazis, and who actually murdered people who rescued Jews from the Nazis. An example of these Polish heroes is Witold Pilecki. He was the only person who voluntarily entered the Auschwitz Nazi death camp. He voluntarily entered the camp so that he could spy on the camp, so that he could take information about the camp and acquire intelligence regarding the camp. And after escaping Auschwitz, he would tell the Allies about Auschwitz. He was the first person to really do this. And he actually endured torture in the Auschwitz camp. He went through all of that to save people's lives. And what happened to Witold Pilecki after the war? He was arrested by the communists, and he was tortured. He was tortured by a man named Josef Rozanski. Rozanski's real name was Joseph Goldberg. And he was then executed by a sergeant named Piotr Smiltański. Now, Witold Pilecki was not the only Polish hero to have gone through this torture and execution. There were many others, but this is just one example. And all of these tortures and executions were done under the oversight of the communist security department. It was the Stalinist Ministry of Public Security, and it was led by Jakub Berman. And Jakub Berman was Jewish, just as Josef Goldberg was Jewish. And yet they murdered people who rescued Jews. I mean, this is I guess you could call it irony, but this is the dark irony of the atrocities that were taking place in Europe during the Second World War and after the Second World War. I mean, you would think, okay, these were heroes. They should have been paraded. They should have been hailed as heroes. They should have been awarded. They should have gotten a street named after them, a town named after them, something. No. What was their end? What was their reward? Torture and execution. It just reminds me of the disciples. I mean, they did all this work for God, preached the gospel, tried to save souls. And what was their end? Beheading, crucifixion, being stoned to death. The ancient Christians worked so hard to save the souls of people. What happened? They were fed to wild animals in the arenas. It's like the end of the hero is not exactly what we hope it is to be. It's like that verse in the New Testament where Jesus is in the synagogue and he says that a prophet is not accepted in his own hometown. He is rejected in his own hometown. And you would think that men like Pilecki would be utterly embraced by those that he risked his life to save. And that was not the case. Jakub Berman would later be interviewed by a woman named Teresa Toranska. And Teresa Toranska confronted Berman on the fact that Polish people who saved Jews were arrested under his government, under his oversight. And she tells him in the interview, in 1948 to 1949, you arrested members of the Home Army Council of Aid to Jews, the Zagota. Zagota was the organization led by Poles to rescue Jews from the Nazis. So she tells them, from 1948 to 49, you arrested members of Zagota. You arrested people who were rescuing Jews. And Berman says, yes, well, all organizations connected with the Home Army were included. The scope was wide. In other words, well, it's not my fault. I mean, we were supposed to arrest everybody. All of the Polish military was supposed to be arrested. Well, even those who were fighting fascism? Yes. So I guess it wasn't really about fighting fascism then. That's the thing. It's like, oh yeah, the communists, the Soviets, they were fighting fascism. Well, sure, yeah, they did, but did the people in the higher ups really care about fighting the ism? About fighting fascism? Was it really about fighting the philosophy, or was it really about power? Was it really about crushing the rival who was an obstacle to you taking full power? Like I said in one of my last videos, the war between the communists and the Nazis was like two dogs fighting for the same bone. And then, so she says to Berman, Mr. Berman, the security services, where all or nearly all the directors were Jewish, arrested Poles because they had saved Jews during the occupation. And you say that Poles are anti-Semites. That's not nice. So she actually tells him, your government, your security services arrested Poles because they saved Jews. And what does Berman say? Berman does not deny this. Berman says it was wrong that happened. So he admits that this actually happened. And then he says, certainly it was wrong. At that time, I didn't have any facts about what this Zagota did. And then, in the same interview, he thanks a woman named Sofia Kozak-Zuka, who was a member of the Zagota, for saving his brother. Not his brother, sorry, his brother's children, for saving his brother's children, so nieces or nephews or both, from the Nazis. So the Poles rescued his brother's children from the Nazis, and then he goes on and murders those very people who rescued his brother's kids. It's really amazing. It's really twisted. So then he says, it was later that my brother, Adolf, secretary to Zagota, told me about it. We later released them all. So then she says, Vladislav Bartozewski was in prison almost 7 years. So he says, I don't know how long he was imprisoned, but I certainly don't deny he was persecuted. He did his time. So he says, yeah, we released all of them. And then she says, well, wait a second. This Vladislav Bartowski, he was in prison for 7 years. How come he was not released earlier? So then she tells him, everyone from the Zagota group was rehabilitated after 1956. So then he says, because she says, everyone from Zagota group was rehabilitated after 1956. So they were released from prison after 1956. And then he says, certainly it was a group of extraordinarily noble people. And so instead of saying like, yeah, we did have these guys in prison for too long, he says, I'm sure they were great people. So then she says, is that all? So he says, look, you must understand, That was 1949 to 1950. I already had some idea of my situation and Stalin's attitude towards me. So I thought that if I got involved in certain things, if I acted against the wishes of the Soviet advisors, then reports about my activities would reach Stalin, who would say, "What kind of behavior is this?" So I had a choice, either leave or maneuver. And he certainly did maneuver. So in other words, he's saying, well, if I did the right thing, then Stalin would not have liked that. It really is sickening. But this is the story of many heroes. They save people only to be persecuted and killed by the people that they risk their lives to save. Sounds like something we heard in Sunday school. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.